Before we begin, take a moment to get comfortable. Let your arms go heavy, your breath slow. And as you listen, feel free to leave a comment sharing what time it is, where you are, and what city or village you're listening from. It's love to know. And if you'd like more quiet stories like this one, don't forget to subscribe so they gently appear when you need them most. Now, let's begin. They built their cities to touch the heavens in the central lowlands of what is now northern Guatemala. The city of Tikal rose from the thick jungle floor like a puzzle of stone and shadow. From above, it looked almost like a natural part of the forested stepped pyramids echoing the mountains, its great plazas breathing in the mists that rolled through the canopy. At its peak, more than 60,000 people lived in and around this ancient city. They farmed, they traded, they worshipped gods older than memory. They tracked the stars with a precision so startling it still humbles modern astronomers. And yet, by the year 900 CE, the plazas were empty. The pyramids sat in silence. Jungle vines crept where children had once played. No conquest, no mass graves, no sudden fires, just abandonment. Quiet, permanent. So, what happened? For many years, theories about Tikal's fall were dramatic. Foreign invaders, massive revolts, supernatural beliefs crumbling under cosmic disappointment. But then the evidence turned more mundane, more patient, and more dangerous. The rain simply stopped coming. Tikal, like so many great Mayan cities, depended entirely on seasonal rainfall. There were no nearby rivers or lakes. Instead, the Maya created complex water management systems, deep reservoirs lined with clay, covered cisterns, sloped plazas to channel the water where it could be stored. They called the rain Chak and built temples to him. They knew when the rains should arrive, almost to the day. It was predictable, reliable, and sacred. But around the late 800s, the skies began to change. Paleoclimatologists studying sediment cores in lake beds near Tikal uncovered layers of dust, mineral ships, and pollen traces that told a slow, unsettling story. The Maya heartland was drying up. The forests thinned. The rainfall dropped. The droughts weren't just occasional dry seasons, they became the norm. Inside a single decade, rainfall could fall by as much as 40%. Crops withered in the heat. The massive reservoirs built to last through the dry season began to fail entirely. And all of this wasn't visible in one moment. It was a slow forgetting. A city built on rhythm, on predictable seasons and sacred cycles began to experience something unfamiliar: irregularity. Still, drought alone cannot explain why people would walk away from stone homes, temples, and fields. Tikal's people weren't helpless. They had faced dry seasons before. They adapted. They were resilient. So what exactly went wrong? The answer may lie in the water, not just its absence, but its betrayal. Recent studies of sediment from Tikal's main reservoirs revealed something strange: high levels of mercury, phosphate, and toxic blue-green algae. During the last decades of the city's occupation, its primary water sources were becoming dangerous to drink. The clay-lined reservoirs, intended to preserve life, were gradually turning into stagnant, poisoned pools. Part of the issue was success itself. With a large population came waste, organic, ritual, and human. Temples and royal courts loomed above the city's water supply, and pigments used in religious ceremonies, especially the bright red cinnabar mercuric sulfide, washed into the reservoirs. At the same time, the lack of rainfall meant lower water levels and less dilution. Algae blooms took over. The water smelled. People fell ill. Some probably died. So imagine this. You wake one morning in the late 800s. The air is thick with humidity, but no rain comes. Your maize field has cracked from thirst. The nearest reservoir has a film of green across the surface. Vomits. After drinking, pray at the pyramid steps, but the priest's incense burns too quickly, the air too dry. You whisper to the rain god Chalk, asking him to return, and still the sky is quiet. You begin to wonder, what if the gods are angry? What if the city is cursed? What if the rulers are hiding something? The stories no longer fit what's happening. The patterns are broken. And so, over time, people began to leave. Not all at once, not with a declaration, Tate, but in clusters first. The farmers, then the stonecutters, then the scribes. Trade slows, ceremonies become smaller. The sound of drums disappears from the temples. We think of collapse as sudden, but this was more like a soft hush. Even the royalty would eventually leave. Their palaces too dry to offer protection. What's left behind are layers of dust, algae-stained reservoirs, and faint carvings of rituals that once pulled rain from the sky. What do we do when the systems we trusted stop working? When nature, once rhythmic and faithful, starts to misfire? And if you can no longer count on the rain can, you count on anything. Let's return to that quiet city in the forest. The plazas are still lined with stone glyphs, their messages carved with care. Even as moss has started to soften their edges, the temples still stand just as tall, just as proud, but something has changed. It's not the buildings, it's not the roads, it's the silence between them. A silence that began not with a scream, but with a dry throat. To understand why people left tickle, we must stop thinking like kings and priests. We must think like the woman who fetched water. It's a farmer who looked to the sky before sowing seeds. It's a child who waited for the rains to cool the air. These were the people who knew the reservoirs best, not as engineering marvels, but as lifelines in a region with no reliable rivers. The Maya of the central lowlands invented a system so elaborate and tuned that some archaeologists call it hydraulic urbanism. Every palace courtyard, temple complex, and market plaza was designed with rainfall in mind. Water flowed from rooftops into channels carved from stone. Those channels fed into large, lined basins. These were not ponds or open cisterns, were sacred instruments engineered to hold life in liquid form, covered with layers of clay and capped with thick plaster. Many of these reservoirs could hold enough water to last months, or even the entirety of the dry season. The largest reservoirs, like the one near Tickle's Temple IV, held millions of liters of water. They were deep, often more than 5 meters, and were sometimes built in layers to allow filtration through sand and charcoal. Some even had stone-lined steps descending into the center, so that as the water level dropped, people could still retrieve it. To see them empty was not just inconvenient. It was ominous. The Mayan calendar, meticulous and mathematical, gave structure to this watery world. There were days set aside for planting, for harvesting, and for ceremonies dedicated to Chakta, god of rain and thunder. There were dances to bring the rain, chants to summon the clouds, and rituals to mark the moment when the sky opened at last. Entire cities pulsed to this seasonal rhythm, but during the decades of the terminal classic period, that rhythm unraveled. Dendrochronology, the study of tree rings, tells us that between 820 and 870 CE, a series of sustained droughts struck the Maya lowlands. These weren't freak years of dry weather. They were repeated failures of the sky, spaced just far enough apart to breed false hope, then disappointment. Trees that normally showed rings of wide, wet growth showed thin, stunted lines. Some years had no discernible ring at all, a silent testimony to rain that never came. Imagine the first time a reservoir failed. Perhaps the rainy season had been weak, but the people made do. They dug a little deeper. They collected runoff from every surface they could find. They held ceremonies twice as long, sang twice as loud. But then the dry season lingered. Weeks passed, The plaster-lined pools, which should have remained half full, now lay cracked at the bottom. Algae bloomed across what little water remained. The heat grew worse. Children cried at night. Elders grew sick from drinking tainted liquid. This wasn't just a hardship. It was a challenge to the very order of the world. You see, the Maya didn't separate nature from religion or politics from cosmology. Every part of life was intertwined. When the reservoirs failed, it wasn't just an environmental event. It was a theological crisis. The kings of Tikal, like those of many Maya cities, ruled not through brute force, but through ritual performance. Their legitimacy came from their role as intercessors with the gods. When the rains came, the people thanked the king. Okay, when the crops grew tall, the king had succeeded in his spiritual duties. But what happens when the gods stop answering? Inscriptions begin to change. Early in Tikal's history, steely carved stone monuments are filled with references to successful battles, long dynasties, and divine alignment. But as the 9th century unfolds, those inscriptions become sparse. Some are never finished. One stela, likely commissioned during a drought period, bears only the outlines of glyphs. The carving was abandoned mid-process. No final blessing. Date. Somewhere during this time, a woman kneels at the edge of a reservoir and dips her jar into water so green it smells wrong. She has no choice. She whispers a prayer not to Chak, but to her mother or her grandmother, or anyone listening she does not yet know. She'll be one of the last to drink from this pool. Archaeologists found bones in Tikal's final occupation, layers that show signs of malnutrition and disease. Children were particularly vulnerable. The maize crops failed frequently during these decades. Without clean water and food, immune systems collapsed. Infections spread faster as sickness crept into homes. So too did doubt. This is the part of history that rarely gets told. Not the battles, not the royal decrees, but the quiet collapse of confidence. One of the most unsettling discoveries about Tikal's end is the absence of warfare. There are no signs of a city under siege, no burnt layers indicating a final invasion, no mass graves of slaughtered elites. The people weren't pushed out. They left, gradually, thoughtfully, desperately. Some may have gone north, to the wetter regions of the Yucatan. Others may have scattered into smaller agricultural communities, living closer to natural springs. The great plazas were no longer worth the risk. The city, once a monument to cosmic alignment, had lost its balance. And so, what becomes of the reservoirs? Left untended, they became death traps. The once smooth plaster cracked. Sediment collected. The algae thickened, forming floating scum. So vivid it resembled emerald paint. Mosquitoes bred in the warm shallows. Disease settled in. But the real tragedy was not the water's disappearance. It was its betrayal. There is something particularly cruel about something once trusted turning poisonous. The tea undermines the instincts people had relied on for generations. It's not just a question of survival. It's a question of belief. For centuries, people had gathered at the edge of these reservoirs and believed they were looking into sacred mirrors, reflections of the gods, the heavens, the past, and future. But now, those mirrors were clouded, green, and dangerous, and so, by the year 900 CE, the city's central reservoirs were still there physically, but no one drank from them. No children bathed at their edges. No priests scattered offerings over their surface, just still water and silence. Today, when archaeologists excavate these sites, they do so with care. They brush away centuries of sediment. They test chemical traces. They study pollen and spores trapped in the mud. They're not just looking for artifacts. They're listening for patterns, clues, the faint echoes of lives once lived with, precision. And what they find is this. The reservoirs that once remembered the rain now remember something else. the slow unmaking of a city, the failure, not of architecture, but of faith in a system that had once worked so well it seemed eternal. How long does it take for a person to realize that home no longer holds the future? And when the water itself turns against you, what choice is left? By now, the stone city is empty of voices. The streets no longer echo with sandals scraping over limestone. Okay? The ceremonial drums are silent. Okay? The great stele once placed carefully to mark dates. Victory's birth stand like forgotten sentinels. Tickle has become a city of memory, half swallowed by forest, and yet the forest too has changed, because it wasn't just the rain that left. The trees did not come back. Let's move closer to the forest edge, to the thin border where farmland once met wilderness. Picture the daily rhythms. A farmer rising before dawn, walking with his children to the edge of a milpa, carefully cleared patch of land meant for planting maize, beans, squash. This system, called Swidden agriculture, was ancient, efficient, and surprisingly sustainable when used properly. The Maya would clear small areas of forest, burn the vegetation to fertilize the soil, plant for a few seasons, then move on and let the land rest for 10, sometimes 20 years. The land remembered. The trees would return. The soil healed itself. But then the population grew during the classic period. The city of Tickle didn't just flourish, exploded. Estimates suggest that at its height, Tickle and its surrounding settlement zones may have supported over 100,000 people. This wasn't just an urban center. It was a pulsating hub of life, trade, ritual, and agriculture that meant more mouths to feed, more land cleared, more wood harvested for cooking, for warmth, for lime plaster, for charcoal used in rituals, for scaffolding needed to build ever taller temples. The forest paid the price. Over time, the fallow cycles grew shorter. Fields were used too frequently. The soil weakened. The trees stopped returning with the same richness. Instead of hardwood forests, secondary growth emerged: shrubs, scrubby palms, thinner trees that offered less shade and held less moisture in the soil. In a stable climate, this shift might have been survivable. But paired with drought and a growing population, it became a slow undoing. Modern researchers used satellite imagery and soil core samples to reconstruct the ancient environment around Tickle. What they found was revealing evidence of widespread deforestation. Charcoal layers in the soil, a decrease in pollen from native hardwood trees, an increase in erosion. Sediment that once flowed gently into managed reservoirs now rushed in, filling them with silt. Even the great causeways that connected Tickle to its neighboring cities began to crumble under the weight of waterlogged, destabilized soil. And then there was the lime dot to build the vast, white plaster surfaces that made Tickle shimmer in the sunlight. Plazas, the steps, the temple walls. The Maya used a labor-intensive process involving limestone and fire. Massive amounts of wood were needed to heat the kilns that produced the lime plaster. To cover just 1 square kilometer in white stucco might require burning thousands of trees. It was beautiful, sacred, reflective of cosmic order, but it cost the forest dearly. You can imagine how the cycle worked. More people meant more food. More food meant more land. More buildings meant more lime. More lime meant more fire. More fire meant more wood. And when the trees were gone, the soil slipped away with the rain, which when it did, came violently, carving gullies through fields, silting up reservoirs, and washing away what little fertility remained. A landscape once balanced between use and renewal became brittle, broken, exposed. So when the droughts came, city was already vulnerable, and when the rains did fall, short bursts of erratic storms instead of long, soaking monsoons, the dry, stripped land could no longer catch and hold the water. It ran across the surface. It evaporated. It disappeared into the air. Let's pause here. Imagine standing on the outskirts of Tikal as this process unfolds, not as an archaeologist, but as someone living through it. You've walked 3 kilometers with your son to reach a field that once belonged to your grandfather. The trees are thinner now, the sun hotter, the soil lighter, almost gray. You plant maize, but it doesn't take. The rains come late, and when they do, they wash the seeds away. The trees no longer protect the crops. The wind tears through the clearing. You go back home with nothing but seeds in your pocket and dust on your face. You wonder, was this land cursed? Was the priest wrong? Or is it the gods themselves who have turned away? Perhaps that's why many households began performing more private rituals in Tikal's final years, individual offerings, family altars, even small, personal shrines carved into home walls. As public ceremony faltered, private belief tried to take root. But faith, like forests, requires nourishment, and without food, without rain, without renewal, even belief begins to thin. Eventually, people stopped planting certain fields. They left tools behind. They wrapped what they could carry. They walked away from homes made of stone and plaster. They took footpaths out of the city and didn't return. They may have headed north toward areas where rain still fell more regularly, or perhaps east toward lakes and rivers. Some likely died on the journey. Others may have been absorbed into smaller communities that still clung to survival. And yet, the forest did not reclaim Tikal immediately. That's one of the most striking facts. For nearly a century after its abandonment, a Titi sat in a strange state of in-between. The large trees didn't come back quickly. Instead, vines and scrubling crept across the plazas. Weeds rooted between the stones. The buildings stood exposed, no longer in use, but not yet hidden. Even nature took its time to forget Tikal. That's the part history often misses. Not the moment of collapse, but the long echo afterward. It's the decades where a place remains in living memory, but no longer in living use. The silence of structures that no longer serve a purpose still stand, waiting, watching, and slowly being covered. By the time European explorers arrived in Central America centuries later, they had no idea cities like Tikal even existed. The jungle had returned at last, cloaking temples in greenery, concealing pyramids beneath hills of moss and root. To the untrained eye, these were simply ridges, rises in the landscape, but beneath them stone, precision, memory. What's perhaps most remarkable is not just that the Maya left Tikal, but that they never truly disappeared. The Maya people endured. Their descendants still live throughout Mexico, Guatemala, Belize, and Honduras. They still speak Mayan languages, still practice ancient customs, still understand the rhythms of land and sky in a way few others do. Tikal's fall wasn't the end of the Maya. It was the end of one way of life, of a monumental, cosmic in scale. It gave way to something smaller, quieter, more scattered, but no less human. And in that shift, there is something profound. The story of Tikal is not about conquest or sudden destruction. It's about slow unraveling. It's about a civilization so advanced it knew the cycles of Venus and built temples aligned to the solstice, yet was still vulnerable to dry skies, shallow roots, and the slow betrayal of the systems it built. In the end, lesson is quiet but lasting. Even the most brilliant civilizations are not immune to the very earth they rise upon. And if the trees do not return, neither do we. Before the gods were carved in stone, before the pyramids stretched upward like staircases for the sky, before the great cities of the Maya crowned the jungle with terraces and temples, there was corn. Not just a crop, not just food. Corn was origin. Corn was identity. According to the Popol Vuh, the sacred book of the Kach Maya, humans themselves were made of corn. The gods had tried other materials, mud, wood, but only corn gave them a people worthy of the world. So when the corn failed, it was not only a famine, it was an existential collapse. This story does not begin in the city of kings. It begins in the dust of the countryside, in a small village a half-day's walk from Copen, where the earth had once been soft and black, and where maize grew thick, with golden heads, tall enough to disappear between the rows. You can imagine a woman kneeling at sunrise, planting kernels with her fingertips, whispering blessings into the soil. Her children help her work. They laugh and run ahead, chasing insects. In the distance, smoke rises from breakfast fires. The world feels full, but the world was already thinning beneath their feet. For centuries, the Maya practiced a delicate form of agriculture that allowed dense populations to thrive in rainforest environments. Terracing, intercropping, and raise fields made it possible to produce enough food to support massive urban centers. In some regions, they even engineered wetland plots called bajos, turning seasonally flooded land into reliable farmland. It was precise, patient, and profoundly respectful of ecological cycles. And yet, something shifted by the late classic period, roughly 600 to 800 CE. Many Maya cities had ballooned in size. As population swelled, the demand for food increased. Maize was central to every meal, eaten fresh, ground into tortillas, fermented into chicha. It was also spiritual. Offerings of cornmeal were made to the gods. Ritual feasts revolved around the harvest. To meet demand, more land was cleared. The Swidden system, which once relied on long periods of fallow time to replenish nutrients, became strained. Forests were chopped faster than they could regrow. The soil, exposed and exhausted, grew brittle. Crops began to underperform. Then came the weather, like in Tickle. Paleoclimatic evidence shows that the southern Maya lowlands experienced repeated droughts during the terminal classic period. These weren't isolated dry spells. They were multi-decade reductions in rainfall, fewer storms, shorter wet seasons, and longer stretches of scorching heat. For maize, this was a death sentence. Corn is a sensitive crop that requires well-timed rain, not just in amount, but in pattern. If the rain comes too early or too late, if the dry spell between planting and tasseling is too long, the harvest collapses. And unlike forest crops or tubers, maize doesn't grow wild. It must be planted, tended, harvested. It is human-made, human-dependent. And so, when it fails, everything built upon it begins to crack. Let's return to the woman and her family. It is the second year in a row her field has given her nothing. Last season, she traded her best weavings for dried beans. This season, there are no traders. They are hungry too. Husband has gone east in search of better land. Her youngest child is feverish. She chews on a piece of copal resin to keep her mouth from going dry. Each morning, she walks to the edge of the millpot. Each morning, the soil crumbles under her heel. Like Ashdod and Copen, the nobles still host ritual feasts. The scribes still inscribe glyphs on steely stories of kings and gods, celebrations of cosmic order. But in the outlying villages, the people are whisperings. Some blame the sky. Others blame the king. Still others blame their own ancestors. There are rumors of people leaving in the night, whole families vanishing toward the mountains. And then, mown season, the seeds themselves rot. This was not just imagined. Archaeobotanical evidence from Copen and other sites has revealed signs of declining crop diversity and increasing reliance on maize monoculture. The more the system strained, the less flexible it became. When blight or pests struck, there were no backups. Three Sisters maize, beans, squash winds, planted in harmony, had been replaced in many areas by maize alone. And when the maize failed, hunger followed. Not the sudden cinematic starvation of disaster movies. This was the slower kind, the kind that hollows cheeks over months, the kind that makes children stop growing. the kind that makes people lethargic, quiet, withdrawn. You can see it in the bones found in burial sites, signs of malnutrition, stunted growth, anemia. Some bodies show signs of repeated injury or infection, their immune systems worn down by lack of nourishment. In the royal courts, things were different at first. Stored grain, tribute from outer villages, elaborate rituals meant to call the maize back. But the writing on the stele changes. The records grow thinner, more repetitive. The same names appear again and again, with fewer recorded victories. Some stele are never finished. Archaeologists note the symbolic shift. In early Maya iconography, kings often appear seated above corn plants, as though sprouting from the earth itself. They wear the maize god headdress, elongated and graceful, with curling foliage. But in the art of the terminal classic, these symbols begin to disappear. The maize god grows rare. Other deities related to death, to drought, to the underworld rise in prominence. There's one carving at Copen that shows a ruler, possibly Yak's Passage, Chan Yopat, the city's final known king, performing a maize offering ceremony. But scholars believe the ritual was symbolic only. By that point, the fields outside the city had already failed. Even the gods could not grow food in exhausted soil. Let's shift now to a market. Keza, a woman, arrives with the last of her gourds. She once brought maize tamales wrapped in banana leaves. She once traded sacks of kernels for pottery or obsidian blades. Today, she offers a few beans and a threadbare cloth. The plaza is half empty. The traders from neighboring cities are gone. No one comes from the south anymore. There are rumors that Quirigua has collapsed. The roads are no longer safe. The air is dry. A child cries. She turns away. There is nothing left to trade. Back in the city, the scribes stop writing. The rulers stop building. One by one, the administrative centers go quiet. People abandon the outer neighborhoods first. Then the artisans leave. The ball courts fall silent. The temples remain, but only as shells. No great fire. No invasion. Just the slow, soft silence that follows the death of food. In the forest, there are still trees. Not as many, but they creak in the wind. The birds still call at dusk. Life does not end its shifts. The deer return to the empty fields. The vines reclaim the roads. The stone faces of the gods grow mossy and obscure, and among the bones and broken pots of a once great city, archaeologists find traces of humanity still trying to survive. A seed cache buried beneath a home. A family altar carved hastily into a wall. A half-burned corn husk in a discarded hearth. Tiny things. It's forgotten things, but real, because collapse is not always loud. Sometimes it is a meal that never comes. In a prayer said over dry soil, in a quiet understanding that this time, the corn is not coming back. What happens to a civilization when the food it believes it was made from refuses to grow? By the time the cornfields stood empty and cracked for the third consecutive year, something subtle but irreversible had already occurred. People no longer counted the planting days. The songs once sung at sowing were forgotten. The sacred bundle of seed, once passed from elder to child, lay unopened in clay jars or was ground down for desperate meals, and in many places quietly, without ceremony, no one planted at all. To understand what that meant, you must remember how completely the Maya world revolved around maize. Planting wasn't merely agricultural, it was sacred choreography. The day the corn was sown was chosen based on celestial alignments. The planting hole was blessed, the seed whispered to, the process repeated by hand, row after careful row. A home without corn growing nearby was not a proper household. A field without maize was not a field. And now there were many. The Maya calendar, One of the most complex timekeeping systems ever devised was woven around the seasons of planting and harvest. The Hob, a 365-day solar calendar, tracked agricultural cycles. Tizakan, a 260-day ritual calendar, governed spiritual timing. Combined, they told people when to pray, when to sow, when to reap. When maize failed repeatedly, that rhythm collapsed. Ritual and reality began to fall out of sync. What happens when the gods' instructions no longer match the world? This is where the psychological unraveling begins. The Maya did not see the world as random or chaotic. Every crack of thunder, every rainfall, every dry wind had meaning, was caused by something. So when the maize failed, they looked for the reason. Perhaps it was political. The king had failed to keep the sacred order. Maybe he had neglected his duties, or offended the gods, or performed a ceremony incorrectly. Maybe the priesthood had grown corrupt. Maybe sacrifices had grown too few or too impure. Fingers were pointed, suspicions whispered. Or maybe it was deeper. Maybe the people had failed. Perhaps they had lived too comfortably, used too much wood, cleared too much forest, taken more than they gave back. Perhaps the corn spirit had turned its face away, not in anger, but in disappointment. But whatever the reason, it became harder to keep trying. So the families in the countryside stopped planting. Some turned to foraging. Some tried beans, cassava, or wild greens. Others began to trap animals, dig edible roots, or collect palm fruit. These were not new strategies. They were as old as the jungle itself, but they were no longer backup plans. They were the new normal. And Copen city officials tried to keep up appearances. There were still ceremonies, still incense burned, still plazas swept. But the crowds grew smaller. The once daily rhythm of tribute and redistribution, where maize and goods flowed in from the countryside and were redistributed in feasts or payments, broke down. The palace received less. The people received less. Market activity slowed. Obsidian tools became rarer. Imported pottery stopped arriving. One curious find from this period is a change in burials. In Copen's earlier years, elite tombs were elaborate, filled with jade shell ornaments, ceramics, and rich offerings. But in the final decades, tombs become simpler, fewer grave goods, less ceremony. In some cases, bodies are found buried under homes without any offerings at all. A test suggests a turning inward, a breakdown of public rituals, and a return to more private, desperate customs. People were still living, still dying, but the sacred frame that once made sense of those events was slipping away. You can see it in the bones too. Its analysis of human remains from this period shows stunted growth, signs of anemia, and even bone lesions linked to long-term malnutrition. Some individuals show evidence of repeated stress during childhood, indicating cycles of hunger, recovery, and hunger again. And still, the corn did not return. One woman, maybe, tried again anyway. She had a few kernels saved. She walked out to the edge of what used to be her family's milpa. The trees had begun to encroach again, thin and scraggly, but fast. She cleared a small space with a wooden hoe. The soil was dry. The air was quiet. She dug 5 holes, pressed the kernels inside, whispered the names of her ancestors, and waited. Weeks passed. Nothing sprouted. She left the field behind. Where did she go? That's the next quiet truth of this collapse. Migration. Not invasion, not conquest, just movement. In the final decades of Copenhagen's life, evidence suggests people began leaving in waves. Some went north to regions with more reliable rainfall. Others moved down into valleys where riverbeds still held water. Some likely vanished into smaller hamlets, away from the decaying grandeur of royal centers. And some left behind offerings. Tiny caches have been found in abandoned homes, obsidian flakes wrapped in cloth, miniature figurines of the maize god, placed near doorways, small piles of charred kernels buried in pots. These weren't grand tombs or palace rituals. These were personal goodbyes, silent prayers to a land that no longer gave back. Archaeologists excavating Copen's Acropolis found something strange. In its final construction phase, the last known royal building project was a platform and finish built atop earlier monuments. It seems hastily made, with reused stones lacking the precision of previous work. It may have been a final attempt to restore legitimacy, to anchor ritual in place, even as everything else fell apart. But it didn't last. The Stele record, no further kings. The court dissolved. The platform was never finished. Outside the city center, life flickered on. People still cooked, still ground what maize they had left, still told stories, still taught children how to weave, how to track animals, how to speak to the spirits of the forest. But it was different now. It's a sacred landscape of the city, its temples, its alignments, its roads no longer governed daily life. Instead, survival did, and slowly, the great plazas filled with dust, the monuments leaned in the sun, and the people, those who remained, forgot the old songs. Not all at once, not completely, but enough to end a world. What makes this story more unsettling is how quietly it happened. The Maya did not vanish. They did not die out. Their cities did, their political structures, their massive rituals. But the people adapted. They moved. They changed. And they remembered, in fragments, what had come before. Even today, in villages across Guatemala, Honduras, Belize, and southern Mexico, maize is still central. Rituals are still performed before planting. Kernels are still blessed. The story of the maize people still holds meaning. But that one season, the one where no one planted, not out of rebellion, not out of forgetfulness, but because they knew it would not grow, that season changed everything. It was not a dramatic end. It was a pause so long, it became permanent. A year without planting, a city without people, a story without an ending. So what happens when a civilization based on maize can no longer count on maize? Can you be the people of the corn when the corn is gone? There is a bowl resting in the corner of a collapsed house. It's cracked down the middle, dust clinging to the glaze. Time has stripped away the paint, but you can still see the faint outline of what it once held. A tole, a warm, thin porridge, made from ground maize. It was a food of the everyday, fed to children, served to guests, stirred slowly in the early morning light before the birds began their songs. Now the bowl sits alone. The house is gone. The family has disappeared, and the corn is no longer growing. This is how collapse feels when it arrives, not through fire or sword, but through famine. Not a single event, but a slow drawing away. A draining of hope. A season that keeps arriving over and over without anything to harvest. The last section of this story begins in one of the most telling places, the trash heaps. When archaeologists sift through the final layers of Copen, they find fewer potsherds, fewer food remains, less of everything, really. The garbage stops accumulating. This sounds mundane, but it's deeply revealing. Cities produce trash. When a place falls silent, even the garbage changes. In Copen's final years, the midden stoves, humbling, historically rich piles of broken ceramics, bones, ash, and food scraps shrink. People had less to throw away, less to break, less to burn, less to eat, and then, eventually, no garbage at all. There's also a shift in the tools themselves. Earlier periods are filled with finely made ceramics, wide metates, grinding stones, polished serving bowls, while the terminal classic layers contain rougher tools, bowls made hastily, grinding stones reused to the point of being ineffective. It suggests a population that no longer had the time, resources, or perhaps will to make the finer things. They were making do, scraping by, prioritizing function over ritual, meal over meaning. Still, some traces of ritual remain. One household shrine, found at the edge of the city's perimeter, contains a figure of the maize god damaged, yes, but carefully placed. Beside it was a bowl with the charred remains of what might have been tamales. Nearby, a child's skeleton lay curled. In burial, arms crossed, a single shell bead placed beneath the tongue. This was not a civilization that forgot how to believe. It was one that held on to belief even as the world fell apart. But belief alone could not feed a child. There's another quiet truth that surfaces from these ruins. One that speaks not to religion or agriculture or kingship, but to something smaller, the family. The collapse of cities like Copen and Tikal wasn't just the breakdown of elite power structures. It was the disintegration of daily life. Households stopped working together. Families split. Younger members migrated. Elders were left behind. Entire neighborhoods appeared to have been abandoned in waves, not with violence, but with resignation. It is in this context that the image of the last bowl of Atoli becomes symbolic. Someone stirred it. Someone drank it. Someone maybe rinsed the bowl, set it aside, and packed a few belongings for a journey north toward La Entrada, or the Motagua Valley, or even beyond. They followed the scent of rain, the promise of better fields, the memory of places where corn still grew tall and sweet. They didn't return. What's strange is that the forest didn't return quickly either. It took decades, sometimes centuries, for the canopy to reclaim these cities. The soil, stripped of nutrients and hardened by sun, needed time to heal. The sacred trees, ceiba, mahogany, Ramon, took longer to reestablish. And without trees, the rain ran off quickly, eroding what little topsoil remained. This environmental delay meant that for a generation or more, the ruins of Copan stood exposed not as buried mysteries, but as open wounds. The wind carried dust through empty doorways, leaves piled on temple steps. The stone faces of long-dead kings gazed out over silence. And yet, not everything ended. Small farming communities in the surrounding highlands adapted. They relied less on maize and more on root crops, wild fruits, and diversified fields. Some shifted from city-based trade to local barter. Others developed new rituals, new calendar systems, new ways of understanding time and space that no longer relied on the Great Pyramids and their shadow-casting alignments. These people were not failures of a fallen civilization. They were survivors of a changing world. That's an important distinction, too. Often, we speak of collapse as if it means extinction, as if the Maya people disappeared when their cities emptied. But they did not. They adapted, moved, remembered, and rebuilt. The fact that they still live today, still speak Mayan languages, still grow maize with reverence is proof that resilience does not always wear the crown. Sometimes it holds a digging stick, sometimes it carries a clay bowl, and sometimes it walks away from what once was in search of what could be. Let's return, just briefly, to that bowl again. A few years ago, a team excavating a humble home at the far edge of Copan found it beneath a layer of roof tiles. The house had collapsed inward, probably during a heavy rain, but beneath the debris, the floor was intact. There was no altar, no burial, no evidence of violence, just a hearth, a grinding stone, a few broken tools, and that bowl inside it. They found the faintest residue microscopic traces of cooked maize, burned along the edge, mixed with traces of chili and possibly cacao. It had been a special meal, perhaps not for a ceremony, perhaps not even for a group. Maybe it was just for one person. Maybe it was comfort, or maybe it was all that was left. The archaeologists called it unremarkable, but it was everything. It was the last bowl of Atole, the final echo of a life still lived. even in the shadows of collapse, because people don't just stop, they continue in smaller ways, and even when the corn fails, they find something else to stir. So maybe that's what this story is really about. Not the great cities, not the fall of kings, but the quiet endurance of the people who had to wake up every morning and find a way to keep going, to make something out of nothing, to believe in the return of rain, to plant even when nothing had grown in years, and to pass that bowl one more time before leaving everything behind. What happens to memory when the world it remembers no longer exists? Can the taste of corn survive without the fields that once grew it? Somewhere deep in the Piton jungle, a man stood beneath the carved lintel of a temple and listened to nothing. It was not an ordinary silence. It was a place that once rang with the voice of God, spoken through priests, shouted in chants, echoed by flutes and drums, and amplified by stone walls designed to carry sound across the plazas. But now, no one called. No one replied. The gods, it seemed, had stopped speaking. This is the story of a kind of collapse that cannot be measured in rainfall or soil loss. It is not a story about climate, though climate plays its part. It is not entirely about food, though hunger lingers in its margins. It is a story of meaning, of language. Oh, belief, what happens when the great systems that organize life, death, and the cosmos grow quiet? And it begins with sound. The Maya were a people of astonishing acoustics. Their cities were not just laid out for convenience or beauty. They were designed with the flow of sound in mind. At Copan, Chichen Itza, and Palenque, archaeologists have marveled at how even a single clap of the hands at the base of a temple staircase can echo like a bird's call, resembling the cry of the Quetzal, the sacred bird of the heavens. In open plazas, the low hum of a conch shell trumpet could travel hundreds of feet. Priests and rulers made speeches from raised platforms, their voices bouncing off limestone facades. In these spaces, silence was not absence. It was anticipation, the stillness before the drums, the quiet before the offering, the hush before the sky opened. But what if the sky remained closed? What if the voices stopped? To understand this, you have to picture a world where communication wasn't just for people. The gods were listening, the ancestors, too. Every ritual, every phrase, every puff of incense meant something to someone unseen. And when the ceremonies failed, the audience was lost. We can begin in a city like Yaxtlan, along the banks of the Usumacinta River, known for its elaborate carvings and narrow plazas hemmed in by high walls. Its stele and lintels depict rulers in full regalia performing bloodletting rituals, pulling thorn-studded ropes through their tongues or genitals, catching the blood on paper and burning it as an offering. The smoke, it was believed, opened a portal between this world and the spirit realm. From that opening, ancestors and gods could emerge, speak, advise. Inscriptions describe visions. One queen, Lady Kayab al-Zouk, is shown conjuring a serpent through which a warrior spirit appears. Other depicts a ruler binding his head in pain as a visioned serpent rises from the steam of burned blood paper. These were not metaphors, to the Maya. These visions were real, facilitated by trance, sacrifice, and fasting. They were performances, yes, but not empty ones. They structured time. They offered reassurance, peace. They reminded the people that the cosmos was still aligned. But as the classic period waned, the rituals grew more elaborate, and the results more ambiguous. There is a change in the glyphs. In earlier times, stele proudly announced dates, victories, cosmic events. Later carvings become crowded, hurried, repetitive. The same kings performing the same rituals, the same phrases copied, as if by rote. Fewer details, fewer new gods, fewer visions. Archaeologists call it ritual fatigue. The rites continued, but the results didn't follow. Let's imagine a priest in one of the final years of Yak's chillin'. He fasts for days. He recites the correct incantations. He prepares the blood-stained bark paper, lights the copal incense, and lets the fire consume the offering. The smoke swirls. The people watch. They wait for the vision, but it does not come. He says it did. Of course, he must. But the people do not feel it. There is no thunder, no cloudburst. The sun remains blistering. The maize fields nearby are brown. Children are coughing. Mothers look away. He continues the ritual. He has to, because if the gods stop responding, what else is left? The silence spread at Lamoni, at Bonopac, at Pedras Negras. The story is the same. The rituals continue, but the responses grow weaker. Bloodletting increases. Temples rise higher. Pyramids grow steeper, as if elevation could compensate for the distance. But something is missing, and the people feel it. Because when belief is collective, when meaning is shared, and seen, and spoken, its weakening is contagious. The priests began to whisper their doubts in private. The scribes hesitate before writing dates. The old women, who remember when the rains came like clockwork, begin to mutter that the world is slipping out of alignment. And then something subtle changes. The soundscape of the city fades. The drum circles grow smaller. The evening flutes go quiet. The chants lose their rhythm. People stop gathering in plazas to hear oracles. The language of power, the specialized speech used in rituals, filled with metaphors and honorifics, goes unused. Some of this is recorded. Glyphs begin to vanish from monuments, not erased, but never carved in the first place. Some stelae are left blank. Others bear only partial inscriptions. The scribes may have lost confidence, or perhaps there was nothing left to say. One tablet, discovered in a shrine near Dos Pilas, bears a date, but no accompanying text. It marks the day, but not the meaning. The priest who carved it knew something had happened. What was supposed to, but could not say what. The gods had stopped speaking, or perhaps the people had stopped listening. This breakdown wasn't sudden. It was slow erosion. First, people lost confidence in kings, then in ceremonies, then in temples, and finally in the very stories that shaped their reality. Because when the gods are silent, even the stone begins to feel empty. What does it feel like to live in a city built entirely to communicate with the cosmos, when the cosmos no longer replies? Imagine walking through a corridor of glyphs, each stone marking a sacred event, a divine encounter, a prophecy fulfilled, and then coming to a blank panel, space meant for meaning but left bare. That's what life in the terminal classic period began to feel like a sentence interrupted. A drumbeat never resumed, a god who turned away. And yet, people tried. One of the most haunting artifacts from this era is a miniature stela found in a private home, not a temple. It bears a simple carving, a woman kneeling, holding a bowl, offering it to a small maize god. No glyphs, no calendar dates, just the image, a private ritual, quiet act of faith. The great temples had gone quiet. But belief had not vanished. It had simply retreated into kitchens, into back gardens, into whispered prayers at night. Even as the great priesthoods faltered, the people continued, but they no longer expected answers. They offered, didn't ask. They prayed, but didn't wait. They told stories to their children, not to preserve cosmic balance, to remember the time when the world still spoke clearly. So, when the last rituals were performed atop the final temple staircases, it was not with triumph, but with resignation. The final incense burned. The final flutes played, hand in. Nothing, no echo, no response, no response, no rain. The sound of collapse is not always screaming. Sometimes it's a quiet between chants, and sometimes it's A man standing beneath a carved lintel, listening to nothing. What does a civilization do when its gods grow silent? Can belief survive in the absence of sound? Even after the voices of the gods faded, the cities still listened. Their walls, built to catch sound and bounce it back like an answer, remained empty but attentive. The carved lintels above doorways, the high stone panels where kings once stood to address the masses, the open courtyards where the breath of music once lingered in the dusk air. They didn't crumble right away. For years, decades, in some cases, they stood, as if waiting for the sound to return. And in that waiting, something strange happened. The people stopped listening with expectation, and began listening with memory. Let's return for a moment to the plaza at Bonampak, where once the walls were painted with scenes of dancers, trumpeters, and priests leading grand ceremonies. These murals, so vivid even now, centuries later, are the closest we come to hearing what these spaces once sounded like. The drumming, the chanting, the roaring of conch shells, the rising cry of the tunku drums echoing across the hills. But when Bonampak was finally abandoned, the murals remained. The sound did not, yet some part of it echoed on not in the air, but in the mind. Across the Maya world, as ceremonial centers fell into disuse, the buildings began to shift in purpose. Grand temples became storerooms. Shrines became shelter. Royal courtyards were taken over by scrub plants and sleeping dogs. In the silence left behind, people remembered. They whispered the old stories, not as commands from the gods, but as comforts. The gods no longer roared through ritual. They lingered in lullabies. It's easy to imagine a grandmother boiling cassava in the corner of a crumbling palace kitchen, singing the maize song under her breath. The children don't know the words, not fully, but they know the tune. Allah, they keep it alive. This is how meaning survives collapse, not through stone alone, but through sound turned to memory. Still, not everyone stayed. In cities like Palenque and Copan, the population decline was sharp. Once the court dissolved and the priests disappeared, the infrastructure couldn't hold. Markets slowed, trade routes fractured. What remained were ghost cities occupied, not by kings, but by caretakers, squatters, or no one at all. But in the rural areas, the story was more complex. There, the quiet spaces between cities, people adapted. Some stopped performing the elaborate calendar rituals that had once required precise astronomical timing. Others merged old practices with new ones. Local deities replaced distant ones. Ancestors took the place of kings. In the absence of a cosmic narrative, people wrote smaller stories, personal, local, practical. A new kind of cosmology began to take root, one based not on what the gods said, but on what the land still gave, because the gods weren't speaking, but the jungle still whispered, and those whispers told of rain, of roots, of rhythms, far older than glyphs. One of the most compelling archaeological findings from this time isn't found in temples, but in cave systems. Deep in the limestone caves of the southern lowlands, people left offerings, small pottery vessels, shaped stones, cornmeal, sometimes bones, sometimes figures of the rain, god chalk, still honored, but in a different way. These caves were not abandoned. They were reimagined as sacred, where the city had grown quiet. The earth had not. The Maya believed that caves were portals to the deep underworld's Palbabat, the place of beginnings and endings. And when the surface no longer answered, they returned to the roots, to the source. Inside these caves, sound behaves differently. A whisper becomes a roar. A footstep echoes forever. The stillness is deep, not empty, but full. To enter is to be absorbed. The Maya knew this. They knew that to descend into stone was to leave behind the noise of the failing world and enter a space where meaning could still be shaped. And so, in the quiet collapse of the cities, cave offerings increased, the rituals changed, and the gods, perhaps, were reimagined as distant lords waiting atop pyramids, but as present spirits embedded in rock and shadow, closer to the people now than they had ever been in the golden age of stele and speeches. This shift from public to private, from loud to quietest, one of the most profound aspects of the terminal classic period. We often look at the fall of Maya cities and see failure. But what if it was also adaptation? The silence in the cities wasn't the end of belief. It was belief finding new places to live and new ways to speak. Let's return again to the architecture of sound. Archaeologists studying the Great Plaza at Copen have long remarked on its acoustic qualities. A person speaking from the eastern stair of the hieroglyphic stairway can be heard throughout the plaza. But after the plaza was abandoned, nature took over. Weeds cracked the stone. Animals made their homes in the niches. The wind blew through open corridors. Somewhere, a boy walks through the ruins. He is not a priest, not a king, just a child. He claps his hands near the base of the stair. He listens to the echo. He smiles. He runs to another spot. Claps again. The sound follows him. He doesn't know the rituals. He doesn't know the gods who once answered. But he knows the plaza remembers him. The echo is real. And maybe, in that echo, there's a kind of continuity, a soft assurance that the world is still listening if it doesn't reply in the old ways. One of the last stele ever carved in the southern lowlands bears a curious design. It has no glyphs, no names, just a spiral smooth, continuous, with no beginning or end. Some believe it's a symbol of time. Others think it's a representation of sound, a vibration, a pulse, a breath, a last message from a culture that had said so much, so loudly, now offering only the shape of a whisper. Perhaps that's what the Maya cities became in the end. Not ruins, but resonant chambers, places where the past continues to speak not through words, but through presence, through layout, through echo, through the gentle way sound bounces between stones long after the people have gone. And so, as the forest returned and vines crept over lintels and parrots nested in palace walls, the silence that once marked collapse became something else, not empty, not abandoned, but still alive. In a different way, because even when the gods stopped speaking, the echoes remained. What happens to a civilization when the voices fade? Do the walls themselves become the storytellers? And is silence always the end? Or just another form of sound? By the time the last rituals were performed on the worn steps of a fading temple, no one expected the gods to answer. But still, the offerings were placed, the chants were recited. The fire was lit, not because anyone believed it would bring the rain back or the visions, or the voices, but because, for a people whose world had been built on stories, there was power in simply continuing the story, even as the cities emptied, meaning lingered like breath on cool stone. We are taught to recognize collapse by ruins stumbled, masonry, vine-choked palaces, broken altars, but collapse is quieter than that. It does not always leave behind drama. It often leaves behind ambiguity. People who stop building pyramids may still build houses. Priest who no longer bleeds for the gods may still mutter prayers in the morning. A language that no longer fills the courtyards may still echo in kitchens and fields. So what happens when a world built on public meaning, the kind inscribed in stone and shouted to the heaven, sinks into private ritual, quiet gestures, and memory passed hand to hand? To answer that, we must go back to the moment after the sound has stopped. After the priest has stepped down from the altar for the last time, after the last flute note has drifted off the edge of the plaza, after the final date has been carved into a stele never to be followed by another dot, we go, stead, into the homes across the Maya world. Archaeologists have discovered that even as major temple construction ceased, domestic structures continued to be maintained. Roofs were repaired, hearths remained active. Small shrines built into corners or beside family gardens appeared where once only great temples had stood. These were not elaborate, state-sponsored rituals. These were humble, local, personal. They required no audience, only intention. Inside one modest home excavated near the outskirts of Dos Pilas, a small clay censer was discovered buried near a wall. It was filled with ash, bits of burned copal resin, and a single green bead. There were no inscriptions, no accompanying text, no date, but it had clearly been used and used with care. The ash had been added in layers. The bead was nestled at the center, as if protecting a memory. Who had made this offering? A farmer's wife, a grandmother mourning a child, a young couple hoping for a better harvest. We do not know. The censer was not placed in a temple, but in a space meant for living, for eating, for gathering, for surviving. That tells us something. Even when the great calendars ceased to be counted and the gods no longer spoke in visions, the people still found ways to speak back, not with stone, not with trumpets, but with whispers and gestures, and the quiet faith that someone or something was still listening. That is how cultures endure, even after their cities fall, not in glory, but in persistence, in the soft rituals of the everyday, in the echo of memory passed forward. Let's stay in that house for a moment longer. It has no windows, only narrow slits to let in breeze and light. The floor is packed to earth. The roof is thatched palm. Near the doorway, there is a bench used, not for sleeping, but for sitting, for watching the light change, for listening to the rain, or for listening to its absence. A mother sits there now, grinding what little maize she has into meal. Her son plays with the carved figurines, paint worn smooth from generations of handling. She teaches him a song, one of the old ones. It no longer matches the festivals, because the festivals have faded. But the melody is simple. The words speak of the maize, God, waking from sleep, of the world beginning again. She doesn't tell him. The gods are silent. She lets him sing, because sometimes silence is not absence. It is preparation, listening, waiting. This reframing from expectation to reflection marks the transformation of Maya culture during the long unraveling of its cities. The gods did not disappear. They receded. They moved from the open plazas to the inner life, from shouted declarations to murmured names, from dramatic rituals to quiet repetitions. And in this transformation, the Maya found a way to keep going. It wasn't easy. Political fragmentation, ecological decline, and social stress made survival a daily challenge. Many people migrated, others perished, but many stayed. They adapted, and through their adaptation, they carried something forward, not the empire, but the essence, the language. For instance, even as scribes stopped carving glyphs into stone, spoken Mayan languages continued. Mothers taught children. Farmers spoke to one another in the fields. Elders recited genealogies at fireside. Glyphs require institutions. Spoken words require only breath. The breath remained, and so did the songs, to this day. Some modern Mayan communities in Guatemala, Belize, and southern Mexico preserve oral traditions that may stretch back to the classic period. Stories of spirit mountains, of gods who live in caves, of sacred numbers and dangerous days, and names that must not be spoken during certain phases of the moon. In these tales, echoes of the old cosmology persist, not clearly, not formally, but enough to remember that there was once a time when every step of a building aligned with a star, and every festival matched the shadow's angle at noon, and every name carved into stone was meant to live forever. Let's turn to one last place, deep in the Chiapas highlands. In a modern Mayan village, there is a field cleared for planting. A boy walks behind his father, dropping kernels of corn into the earth. Before they begin, the father kneels, scoops a handful of soil, and speaks softly in Saltel. He says thank you to the earth. He asks for rain. He offers a few grains of corn, pressing them gently into the center of the field. It is not a grand ritual, but it is old, older than stone, older than writing. And when the wind moves across the mountains and touches the field, it makes a sound soft like cloth, or the hush of breath. It sounds like something being remembered. So maybe that's what remained long after the cities fell. Not the gods as they had once been known, not the rulers, not the rituals exactly, but the practice of meaning. The whisper that the world, however uncertain, still listened if only you spoke gently. And when meaning becomes a whisper, it doesn't vanish, it lingers, it waits, it hides in bowls and songs, in names scratched on the underside of stones. It slips between the ruins, and if you listen carefully, not with ears, but with patience, you might still hear it. What becomes of a people who no longer hear their gods? Do they fall silent, or simply speak more softly? To understand how the Maya cities fell, you have to stop thinking in terms of outside enemies or sudden disasters. Sometimes collapse does not come from the outside. Sometimes it grows quietly from within. There was no single war, no decisive battle, no great betrayal that brought down the classic Maya kingdoms. Instead, there was a quiet fracturing, a splintering of power, a slow pulling apart of something once tightly woven in the Maya world. Every city was its own kingdom. These weren't unified empires like Rome or Egypt. Each city, state, Titical, Calakmul, Copan, Karakol, Das, Pilas, had its own ruler, its own dynasty, its own alliances and enemies. They formed a loose network of rival courts, trading and fighting, marrying and backstabbing, all while claiming descent from divine ancestors in the favor of the gods. At the center of each of these kingdoms stood the Kawul adored the Holy Lord. More than just a king, he was a cosmic pivot, a human bridge between the sky, the earth, and the underworld. His blood was sacred. His words carried weight beyond Lenten meaning itself. And yet, toward the end of the classic period, something changed. Let's begin in a city deep in the Petexbatan region. Nestled along the river banks, Das Pilas, founded in the 7th century as an outpost of Tikul's power. Das Pilas was led by a scion of the Tikul dynasty, a man named Balai Chan Kayawel. But within a generation, this outpost became a rival. Civil war erupted between Das Pilas and Tikul itself. This was no mere feud. It was a war of legitimacy. Both cities claimed the right to rule. Both traced their dynasties back to the same divine ancestors. Both insisted that the gods had placed the mantle of kingship upon their own shoulders. And so, brothers fought brothers. Cousins led armies against cousins. Families split, not across belief or border, but over the meaning of power itself. This pattern repeated across the Maya world, where once kings ruled unchallenged from the center of massive cities. Now, regional elites began asserting their own independence. Nobles who once bowed in court started building their own courts. Minor lords took on titles once reserved for high kings. Dynasties fragmented. Cities that had once formed the core of vast alliances were now surrounded by former vassals turned rivals, and in the process, the great centers began to weaken. It wasn't immediate. The buildings still rose. The rituals still continued. But the unity was gone. The narrative had split, and with it, the ability to organize resources, maintain infrastructure, respond to crisis. Imagine a world where every neighboring town believes itself the rightful heir to heaven's favor, where every village builds its own temple, names its own king, performs its own calendar rites, and refuses to recognize the others. The ceremonies still happen, the gods are still honored, but the calendar begins to falter. The stars are interpreted differently. The same festival is celebrated on different days. Rainfall becomes harder to predict. Trade breaks down, and when drought comes, there is no coordination. No single leader can organize food distribution. No city has the trust of the others. No alliance holds long enough to rebuild the reservoir, or dig the canal, or transport the grain. Instead, they turn inward. They prepare their own feasts. They protect their own fields. They close their gates. This is how fragmentation feels, not like chaos, but like shrinking. Inscriptions from the late classic period become increasingly self-referential. Kings no longer speak of building a unified world. They speak of their own deeds, their own ceremonies, their own glory. Titles become inflated. Glyphs grow longer, more grandiose, but less connected. Stele record local events, mall rituals, marriages, minor temple constructions as if they were world-shaking achievements. It's as if every ruler began shouting louder, hoping anyone would still believe they were important. Meanwhile, the old roads Sakbe grew over with weeds. The great white causeways that once connected cities for trade, diplomacy, and pilgrimage fell into disuse. Merchants stopped traveling. Ritual specialists no longer crossed borders to read the stars together. Tribute payments dried up. Political marriages became rare, and the borders hardened. Some kingdoms, like Kalakmel, attempted to hold on to their influence through military might. They built vast alliances, controlled dozens of smaller polities, and tried to dominate the geopolitical map of the lowlands. But even Kalakmel faltered in the end. Its own vassals grew tired of sending tribute. Its own roads fell apart. And as internal stress built, external control evaporated. Let's return to Das Pilas for a moment. Toward the end of its life, the city built a massive wall. It's not just a symbolic barrier, true fortification. It's the first of its kind in the lowlands. Thick, tall, desperate. Archaeologists believe it was built during a period of intense warfare. The city tried to protect itself from its own former allies, but the wall did not save them. Dos Pilas fell anyway abruptly, and with fire. Its royal palace was abandoned, Stele left unfinished, its rituals forgotten, because the enemy was not some far-off invader. The enemy was the idea that power should be shared by no one, that every king was a world to himself, that the gods could be pulled down from the heavens into private hands. In such a system, even the gods grow tired, and even the sky begins to disagree. But perhaps the most telling part of this story lies not in who fought, but in who disappeared. In the final years of the classic period, we see entire regions lose their ruling elites. Inscriptions vanish not because the cities are empty, but because no one bothers to record the names of kings anymore. The ritual specialists fade from view. The royal bloodlines stop being mentioned, and yet the people remain. They plant what they can. They gather around village fires. They build homes from wood and thatch, but the old struck to the pyramid of thatch. Power has crumbled, and in its place is only dust. This is not a conquest. This is not an apocalypse. This is what happens when belief becomes fragmented. When the thread that once held 1,000 cities together as a sacred web begins to fray. And in that fraying, even the voice of the gods grows quiet, not because they have stopped speaking, but because there are too many voices at once. Each insisting that theirs is the only one that matters. What does a kingdom become when it no longer believes in being one? And how long can a throne stand when no one agrees where it should sit? It, the Maya world, in its prime, resembled a vast constellation not of stars, but of cities. Each one shone with its own light. Each followed its own cycle, marked its own days, spoke its own version of power. And for centuries, these lights flickered in careful harmony. But eventually, like stars aging into collapse, they began to drift apart. The fragmentation of power in the Maya lowlands did not happen in a single moment. It unfolded slowly, unevenly, across centuries. Some cities collapsed quickly, others lingered for generations. But what united their downfall was not destruction, it was disconnection. And at the center of this unraveling stood the lonely lords. Once, kings like Jisal, Chan, Kaawil, I of Tikal, or Yuknumchin, II of Kalakma, ruled over networks of dozens of smaller cities. Their authority rested on more than just conquest. Titwa rested on cosmic legitimacy. They claimed descent from the gods. Their rituals kept the calendar aligned with the heavens. Their words shaped time. But as alliances fractured and cities splintered, smaller lords began to assert power in isolation. They still built monuments. They still performed rituals. They still invoked the names of gods and ancestors. But they did so alone. What does power feel like when no one is listening? Let's look closely at a city like Ajiwat in the 8th century. Aguateca was a thriving ceremonial center perched on a cliffside, surrounded by defensible walls and steep canyons. Its nobles lived in large palaces. Its artists carved fine glyphs. Its scribes recorded names with flourish. But toward the end, something odd happens. Monuments are still carved, but they're modest. Names appear less often. The language becomes less formal. The court no longer hosts grand events. Instead, we find private shrines, informal gatherings, family altars. It's as if public power had turned inward. Archaeologists working at Aguateca discovered entire elite homes that appeared to have been abandoned suddenly, with possessions still in place, tools, ornaments, vessels, a grinding stone here, a half-finished bowl there, not looted, not burned, just left behind. One of the most compelling interpretations is that these were the homes of minor lords who had broken away from central authority. They ruled alone. They tried to maintain prestige through architecture and ritual, but without the broader network of trade and tribute. Their palaces became shells, grand on the outside, empty within. Still, the desire for grandeur persisted. In the waning years of many cities, construction didn't stop, it intensified. Temples were raised higher. Stele grew taller. Courts were rebuilt, but the workmanship declined. The cuts were rougher, the inscriptions sloppier, the plaster thinner. In some cases, earlier monuments were cannibalized old stones, stolen from collapsed temples and reused in new ones. It was an architectural illusion. It's the appearance of prosperity masking a deeper emptiness. This phenomenon wasn't unique to Aguateca. At Uzma in the Puk region, construction continued into the terminal classic period with incredible vigor. The nunnery quadrangle, the governor's palace, monumental architecture that still impresses today. But these buildings lack the rich inscriptions of earlier Maya centers. No stele tell us of the kings who ruled here. No calendar dates fix their reigns in time. Why? Perhaps these rulers did not want to be compared to the past. Perhaps they had no lineage to claim. Or perhaps the people no longer cared who ruled, so long as someone could maintain the facade. In such a world, power is a performance without an audience. Still, the lords persisted in city after city. We find evidence of kings and nobles maintaining the rituals of rule bloodletting, feasting, temple building, as their populations dwindled and their trade networks collapsed. They wore the masks of power long after the face had vanished. But power, when isolated, becomes brittle. Without alliances, there were no reinforcements in times of conflict. Without trade, There were no luxury goods to distribute at feasts. Without shared calendar rituals, there was no agreed upon time to plant or pray. And without people, there was no kingdom. Let's imagine one such lord. He lives in a city that once thrived, its plazas filled with dancers and scribes, its markets noisy with barter and talk. Now, the streets are mostly empty. A few families remain. The marketplace is quiet. The temple steps are worn but unused. Still, he wakes before dawn. He climbs the temple stairs. He carries a torch, a shell trumpet, a bowl of incense. He wears a jaguar pelt, though it's grown stiff from disuse. He bleeds his ear with an obsidian shard. He drips blood onto bark paper, folds it carefully, sets it alight. The smoke curls upward. He speaks the names of the gods. He listens. There is no answer, but he does it again the next morning, and again, because that is what lords do. And if he stops, then even the illusion of power will vanish. In many Maya cities, the final monuments are strangely private, small, steely placed inside household compounds. Tiny altars tucked beside back doors. These weren't meant for the whole city. They were meant for a family, a lineage, perhaps even a single person. The performance of rule had been reduced to ritual maintenance. Kingship was no longer about organizing society. It was about surviving its disintegration with dignity. We should be careful not to mock these men. They were not deluded. They were trying to preserve something to hold onto order, memory, kanta, in a world that no longer recognized those things. And perhaps can, in their own way, they succeeded. Because long after their cities collapsed, the people remembered. They remembered the stories, the gods, the ceremonies, not in full, not always accurately, but enough to keep something alive. In the highlands of Chiapas and the hills of Guatemala, Maya communities continue to name their days, bless their seeds, honor their dead. The great kings are gone, but the rituals persist in this way. The lonely lords became more than rulers. They became the final links in a chain of memory, stretching across time, not because they governed effectively, but because they refused to. Stop speaking even when no one replied, even when the court was empty, even when the gods had gone quiet. That kind of endurance leaves echoes, not in stone, but in story. What does a ruler rule when the city is gone? And can silence itself become a form of power? There's a moment that never makes it into the stele. It's too quiet, too ordinary. No drum roll of conch shells, no bloodletting ceremony. Just a moment at dusk, when a boy asks his father, "What was the name of our king?" And the father doesn't know. That was the day the lineage was forgotten. It didn't come with fanfare. There was no final proclamation. No last royal tomb sealed behind plaster and incense. The forgetting came slowly, like a tide receding so gradually that no one noticed until their feet were no longer wet. The kingdoms had once been defined by names, names carved into stone, names that carried weight, stretched across generations, connected to the gods. But now, the names were slipping, one by one. The thrones of the classic Maya world had emptied, some through violence, others through neglect. Few kings, likely, fled their cities. Others may have been quietly replaced by local lords who no longer claimed the bloodline, but claimed the house. In some cities, like Caracol or Yaxkilin, the final inscriptions appear hopeful, still invoking celestial cycles, still performing rituals of renewal. But they are the last entries in a fading dialogue. After that, the silence. It is tempting to look at these final rulers, those who wrote the last glyphs, built the last temples, climbed the last stairs to bleed into the fire. Imagine that they failed. But perhaps it's more accurate to say they held the door open as long as they could. And when the house behind them emptied, they closed it quietly, as the wind wouldn't blow everything away. Let's walk through one such house. It sits on the northern edge of a once grand plaza. The steps are chipped from years of use. The roof is gone now, but in its time, it would have been thatched with palm. The beams decorated with red and black paint. Inside, there's a bench carved directly into the stone wall, storage niche, and, beside it, a smooth piece of limestone. Worn with use, this was likely a writing surface, a place where a scribe once prepared glyphs, or a priest recited the calendar, or a father taught his son how to speak to the spirits. But now the surface is blank. No tools remain, just the stone, smooth, silent. It's possible the family moved, or died, or forgot, because in the end, it was not the temples that crumbled first. It was the systems of meaning that made those temples. Matter, without the calendar, the solstice passes like any other day. Without the king, the rituals become private gestures. Without the story, the stone becomes just stone. Archaeologists call this process urbanization. Cities didn't vanish overnight. People simply stopped living in them as cities. Plaza that once held thousands now held only a few dozen. Palaces were repurposed. Temples became homes for birds. Market stalls stood empty. The infrastructure remained, but the intent was lost, and with it, the names, royal dynasties, once remembered and recited like sacred poetry, began to shorten. Genealogies were forgotten. Ancestors faded into myth. In some regions, even the names of the gods changed. The sky god became the rain god. The sun god split into two beings. Stories fractured, but meaning didn't disappear. It adapted. In the Central Highlands, Maya communities began to organize themselves not around kings, but around councils of elders. Leadership became more communal. Rituals more seasonal, more agricultural. Power was no longer justified by bloodlines, but by wisdom and tradition. Instead of lineage, memory was carried in practice. The planting ritual, the burial chant, the marriage blessing, all spoken, none written, and because they were spoken, they changed, evolved, survived. In this way, the Maya did not collapse. They dissolved like salt into water. The cities broke apart, but the people flowed into new forms, carrying pieces of the past with them. Some became legends. Others became lullabies. Even the language shifted. The formal court language, filled with glyphic metaphors and complex titles, fell out of use. What remained were the everyday tongue school, Yucatec, Keish, Tiltel. These continued in kitchens and markets, in fields and footpaths. Words remembered, not because they were carved in stone, but because they were useful. One word, in particular, persisted. AJAW.Lord.Ruler.Or, in later usage, someone who speaks for others. Not commands, but stories. Because in the end, the loss of kingship did not mean the loss of voice. It meant the voice became softer, closer, human. Back in the ruins of a small city, say, Aranjo or El Purge, archaeologists uncover a curious find. A stela, toppled and broken, buried beneath a layer of household debris. It had been repurposed, smooth side, used as a tabletop. The carved face turned inward, pressed into the ground. No one had tried to preserve the name it bore, but no one had destroyed it. Either it was simply not needed anymore. What does that mean? That people were no longer interested in remembering kings? Or that they had found other ways to remember? In a nearby cave, offerings from the same period tell a different story. Here, bundles of burned corn, jade pebbles, and ceramic figures are arranged carefully in niches. No inscriptions, no names, but clearly placed with care. Someone had come to this place, dark, echoing, sacred and spoken, offered, remembered. These were not royal rituals. These were personal. When kingship faded, memory moved into other spaces. The household the hillside, the garden, the dream. One woman, perhaps, closed her eyes before sleep and whispered the names her grandmother had told her, names of ancestors, names of stars, names of rains. She didn't know how to write them, but she remembered the sound. She taught it to her daughter, who taught it to hers, and so it continued not in stone, but in breath. Meanwhile, the jungle crept back over the cities. Trees grew on roofs, roots split walls, vines painted everything green. The names carved into lintels were buried in silence, the glyphs forgotten, but not entirely, because centuries later, others would come, linguists, epigraphers, archaeologists, sand dust off the stones. They would match symbols, translate dates, reconstruct dynasties. They would resurrect names that had not been spoken aloud in 1,000 years. And still, in the Maya villages nearby, people would plant corn with the same cares, not because they knew the ancient kings, but because they remembered what mattered: the rain, the seed, the story. So what happens when the last name is forgotten? The name carved into a stela meant to last forever. Does the memory die? Or does it simply return to the earth, waiting for someone else to speak? It's not the same name, but a name like it, close enough to carry its shape, close enough to matter, close enough to mean. For centuries, the Maya world was stitched together by rivers, not roads, not stone highways, not armies, but by the slow, dependable current of water. But the rivers carried everything: salt, obsidian, cacao, feathers, shells, stories, songs, gods. If a city had access to a river, it had access to life. But in the end, the boats stopped coming. This is the story of one of those rivers. It's called the Usumacinta, a winding, unpredictable ribbon of water that marks the border between modern-day Guatemala and Mexico. In the classic Maya world, the Usumacinta was more than a natural feature, was an artery, a wide, brown, and breathing link between the highlands and the lowlands, between the inland cities and the coast. Along its banks rose some of the most important cities of the Maya: Yaxchilan, Pedras, Negras, Pomona, each built close enough to see the water, close enough to hear the paddles when they came. And, for a long time, they did. Canoes carved from ceiba trees, the sacred tree of life, glided along the current, carrying traders and tribute, jade and incense, ceramic pots filled with dried fish or honey or powdered dye. The paddlers were strong, silent men, cargo covered in woven cloth. Sometimes messages traveled faster than the goods carried in memory from one ruler to another. There were no written bills of lading. The rivers kept their own ledgers. To live in a riverside city was to be at the center of everything. The first sign of trouble wasn't war. It wasn't drought. It was lateness. A shipment that usually arrived in mid-month didn't come. A messenger expected by sunrise appeared 2 days later. A festival was held with fewer offerings. A bride arrived with half her dowry. The feathers weren't bright. The cacao tasted flat. No one panicked. Rivers could be slow. Weather changed. Perhaps the boats would come tomorrow. But then, they didn't. And so, the couriers were sent upriver to check, to ask, to wait. And they didn't return either. We know from archaeological records that by the 9th century CE, trade along the Usumacinta had begun to break down. Goods that were once common obsidian from the highlands, spondylus shells from the sea, turquoise, salt, cotton cloths start to disappear from inland sites, or they appear in reduced quantity of lower quality. Some luxury goods vanish entirely. This wasn't just a supply issue, it was a trust issue. Trade requires not just goods, but belief that someone will keep the promise, send the package, make the journey, that the river is safe, that the destination is worth reaching. It's the Maya world fractured politically, that trust eroded. Cities like Yaxchilan and Pedras Negras had long competed for control of the river. They built steely, boasting of captured lords, tribute flows, and marriage alliances. But behind these glyphs was the reality of geography. To move along the river meant passing through multiple territories. And as central control weakened, those territories became more uncertain. Was the next bend protected or patrolled? Would the next port welcome you or rob you? A journey that once took 2 days now took 4 or 5, or never ended at all. Let's imagine a merchant. He's from Pomona, a medium-sized site near the Gulf Coast. His canoe is loaded with salt and dried fish, basic goods, but valuable inland. He's made this trip before. He knows where to stop, where to sleep, which officials expect a bribe, which villages will trade fairly. But this year, everything feels different. The first checkpoint is abandoned. The wooden dock is collapsing. He continues. At the second stop, a young man with no insignia demands payment. He claims to represent a new lord. The merchant doesn't recognize the name. He pays anyway. It's not worth the risk. Further upriver, he passes a burned village. Smoke still clings to the leaves. Doesn't stop. He arrives in Pedras Negras to find the market half empty. The scribes are still carving, but no one reads the announcements. The royal court is quiet. The last dealer was raised years ago. He sells his goods at a loss and paddles home without ceremony. Next season, he does not return. Multiply this decision by 100, and the river begins to thin, not physically, but functionally. Fewer traders, fewer messages, less information, less connection. A kingdom becomes an island. This isolation has consequences beyond economics. The Maya relied on trade, not just for goods, but for culture, religious ideas, artistic styles, political alliances, all moved by river. When that movement slowed, so did the cultural coherence of the region. Regional styles flourished briefly, but without external input. Even those began to fade. One city might still hold ceremonies to mark the Venus cycle. Another might forget entirely. In one city, the rain god is still Chaak. In another, he has become a jaguar, or a mountain, or a man. The calendar becomes local. Time itself fragments. And meanwhile, the jungle keeps growing. The river does not stop flowing, but now it flows past empty ports. The docks collapse. The loading platforms vanish. Canoes rot on the shore. Fishermen still go out, casting nets close to home. But the long-distance merchants are gone, and with them, stories. This is something often overlooked in trade systems. The importance of human carriers of knowledge. Merchants were not just traders. They were memory keepers. They knew the paths, the people, the changes. When they stopped coming, cities lost their mirrors. They no longer knew what was happening at river or down, and so rumors spread that the coast has fallen, that Tickle no longer answers. Messengers that the gods have changed names, that the river is cursed. In time, people stop even remembering which cities lie where. The map shrinks to what you can see, what you can walk to. The river becomes local again, and the kingdom that once relied on it becomes a collection of scattered farms. Still, for a while, the people wait. Each season, a woman walks to the riverbank with her basket. She scans the current, not for fish, but for movement. For a canoe, she remembers the rhythm, the sound of wood against water. It's a song the traders used to sing as they approached, but the water carries only silence now. Still, she watches, because 1 year, many years ago, boat came. It could come again, and that waiting becomes a kind of ritual, an echo of what once was. Eventually, the waiting stops. The river returns to the animals, to the trees, to the sky reflected on its surface. But beneath its surface lies sediment layers of history. rich with pollen and pottery and bone. The quiet archive of a trade network that once bound together a civilization. And centuries later, when archaeologists sift those layers, they will find the markers of decline. But what they are really finding is something else. The memory of motion. The ghosts of canoes. The silence that followed the last shipment. What happens to a city when it no longer receives visitors? What happens to a river when the world forgets what it was for? Before the jungle swallowed them, the river ports were alive with voices. Shouts from boatmen guiding canoes through shifting currents. Scrape of pottery against wood as bundles were unloaded. The slap of bare feet on dock planks. Traders bartering. Children running through the markets with hands sticky from honey cakes. Scribes reciting tribute lists. Priests inspecting offerings bound for distant kings. Parrots in cages. Tortoises tied with twine. Salt, dried fish, jade. Then, without violence, they emptied. There was no cataclysm, no mass migration, no final invasion, just a slow erosion of trust. A thickening of weeds where walkways once lay, a silence that deepened each season until the river ports, like the river itself, came a reflection of memory. All was moving, never solid. It started small, as most disappearances do. A merchant didn't show. A tax was raised. A road washed out. A village refused a demand. A marriage alliance dissolved. A border dispute flared, not into open war, but into tension enough to reroute a canoe to a safer path. The market that had been scheduled still happened, but with fewer goods. The priests still showed up to bless the boats, but fewer boats arrived. Riverside cities, such as Pomona and Morella Forma, once vibrant linkages between the inland cities and the Gulf Coast, became bottlenecks. Their plazas, once filled with coastal salt and shell artifacts, now displayed more local wares. Their temples still stood tall, but the stele stopped, including references to far-off cities. The language narrowed. That's how we know trade was dying. Not from what we find, but from what stops being mentioned in earlier centuries. Maya inscriptions on monuments were rich with references to distant cities. A stela raised at Patras Negras might commemorate a ceremony involving lords from Yaxtilan and Tikal. A carving in Pomona might mention a war won on the far side of the mountains. These were not random details, they were signals. Trade was political alliance brought goods, goods brought tribute, tribute gave prestige. But by the late 800s, these inscriptions grow quiet. The foreign names disappear. Kings speak only of themselves. One stela found near the Uja carries a date, a name, and nothing more. No visitors. Context. No trade. It's as if every kingdom has started, speaking only to itself. But rivers do not serve kingdoms. They serve connections. And when the connections die, so does the reason for the port. Imagine a riverside market in its final years. The stalls are still their wooden tables, palm leaf canopies, but the colors are gone. The birds no longer arrive in cages from the forests of the south. The obsidian blades are dull and local, not sharp and black from the highlands. A woman sells salted fish from a nearby stream, not from the Gulf. A child turns over a shell and asks what it is, because he's never seen one. The priest still blesses the plaza before dawn, but he looks at the sky more than the crowd, waiting for a boat that no longer comes. In these years, some cities tried to hold on at Yaxchila. Lords continued to carve monuments. One depicts a king capturing a foreign noble, likely to show that trade routes were still under control. But the monument is shallow. The carving light, as if even the stone had lost conviction. At Piedras Negras, the temples still held court, but the markets shrank. Ceramic styles, once shared across regions, became distinct. Local glaze, local designs, local pigments. A kind of regionalism took hold not by choice, but by necessity. Without trade, cities turned inward, and inwardness, for the Maya, is a kind of death, not biological, but cultural, because the Maya world was never meant to be static. The calendar turned, the stars shifted. Time traveled to lock oneself into a single location, a single cycle. A single story was to risk being forgotten by time itself. That was the real danger. Not war, not famine, but stillness. Trade was how the Maya remembered one another. When the canoe from the coast arrived, it brought not just salt and fish but stories. News of the last eclipse, the date of a royal birth, a new way of decorating temples, a different pronunciation of a sacred name. These differences sparked connection. They reminded people that they were part of something bigger. Shared rhythm, shaped by movement. When the canoes stopped, the stories stopped, and when the stories stopped, memory frayed. Let's look at a lesser-known riverside town, Lamar, once a small but respected port between the great cities of the Usumacinta Basin. Lamar served as a waypoint. It had no grand temples, but it had roads. It had a market, had inns for traders. For years, it was prosperous because it listened, collected, stored, passed on. But Lamar has no terminal classic inscriptions. None. Its monuments stopped completely. The pottery becomes simpler. The architecture ceases. Excavations revealed that the city was not burned, not attacked. It was simply abandoned. One theory suggests that Lamar became too isolated to survive, as the larger cities retreated into their own shrinking zones of influence. There was no one left to supply or demand. The port became obsolete. Even the river, once a highway, became a boundary, and boundaries are not where cities thrive. So Lamar faded. It joined the long list of places where silence fell like dust, not just over buildings, but over identities. The people moved inland, or to higher ground, or merged with other villages. The name of the city survived only in stone. The river passed by, indifferent, but not all ports vanished completely. Some adapted in the Pook Hills. Far from the great rivers, cities like Uzmal and Labna continued to build. Their architecture flourished even as the lowlands collapsed. Why? Because they had never relied heavily on river trade. They relied on roads. When the rivers fell silent, the land cities kept whispering through messengers, through runners, through caravans. It wasn't the same. It was slower, thinner, but it survived longer. Still, even in these cities, you can feel the difference. The grandeur remains, but the outside world shrinks. The temples speak only of local gods, the monuments name only local kings, and the rivers are no longer mentioned at all. Let's return one final time to the riverbank. It is early morning. Mist drifts across the surface. A boy stands barefoot in the mud, holding a fishing spear. He's quiet, listening. He's never seen a canoe come from downstream. His grandfather tells stories of when they did. Stories of boats with bright claws, of traders who spoke strange words, cacao and shells and red feathers. The boy nods. He likes the stories, but he doesn't quite believe them, because the river is silent, and he only knows what he sees. He watches the water ripple, casts his spear, and wonders what it was like to live in a world that moved. What does a river become when it stops carrying strangers? And what does a people become when the world no longer arrives? It was a simple bowl, unfired clay, no paint, no inscription. It rested at the edge of a riverbank near the ruins of a small Maya port town, tucked behind a fallen tree, nestled among roots, protected from centuries of storms. When archaeologists found it, the bowl still held traces of its final contents: burned copal, crushed cacao shells, and a single bead of greenstone no larger than a fingernail dot. This was not trade. This was memory. Someone had placed it there long after the markets had vanished, long after the river canoes had ceased to glide past. An offering, not for profit, not for tribute, but for remembrance, for something lost, because even after the boats stopped coming, the river still flowed. And for the Maya, rivers were never just routes of trade. They were living beings. They had moods, voices, names. They connected not just people, but realms, surface to underworld, cities to ancestors, drought to hope. To offer something to the river was to speak to the past and the future at once. So whoever placed that bowl, perhaps a grandmother, perhaps a fisherman's daughter, perhaps a former trader who remembered the sounds of paddles in the water, they were not just mourning trade. They were acknowledging its absence, naming it, because sometimes it's the only way to keep something alive is to say goodbye to it properly. Let's walk along that river now. The Uja Macenta winds slowly through the landscape. In some places, it rushes with force, carving cliffs. In others, it meanders, widening into shallow pools filled with lilies and insects. Along its banks, the jungle has reclaimed what the cities surrendered. Ceiba trees stretch their roots through collapsed warehouses. Howler monkeys perch on once ceremonial stairways. The stones that once bore tax records now house ants. But if you look closely, you can still find traces. A carved bench, worn smooth. A loading platform, its corners sunk. The remains of a canal, now just a long depression, overgrown with ferns. And in places where boats once moored, smooth stones still carry the polish of centuries of wet wood pressing against them. There are no guards, no fences, just silence and memory. The Maya had names for these places, not the modern names, the Yaxchilans and Pedras Negrazes, but the names they gave the rivers themselves. Names that meant things like breath of the earth, or mirror of the sky, or pathway of the ancestors. These names have been lost. The glyphs that recorded them are worn. The sounds have changed, but the reverence remains. Even today, in some Maya communities, rivers are treated as sacred. Children are taught not to shout at them. Offerings are still made flowers, bits of food, prayers whispered into leaves and set afloat. This is not nostalgia. It is continuity, because while trade as an economic engine collapsed, the relationship with the river did not. What changed was scale. In the classic era, rivers were the veins of empire. They carried obsidian from the Guatemalan highlands, salt from the coast, cacao from the lowlands, jaguar pelts from the interior. Cities rose and fell depending on their access to water, but as fragmentation took hold, as political alliances broke, as trust dissolved, the river became smaller in the minds of those who lived beside it, still powerful, still sacred, but no longer wide enough to carry a world. The last canoe launched, not with fanfare, but with routine. A trader took one final trip. He loaded salt, or shell, or cacao into the hull. He paddled for hours, or days. He reached a place that once welcomed him, and found it changed. The market, quiet. The docks submerged. The Lord absent. He sold what he could, and did not return. His canoe was perhaps used again by his son, or not at all. Eventually, it was left in the reeds, where it filled with rainwater and insects and silence. Archaeologists never found it would. Decays quickly in the tropics, but the absence is felt in pottery styles that vanish, in bones that show. More signs of hunger, in temples that no longer mention distant cities. One by one, the river towns turned inward. Their stele stopped referencing seashell offerings or coastal alliances. Their glyphs became provincial, if they continued at all. Their gods, once adorned with feathers from afar, now wore local cloth. This isn't failure. It's retreat, adaptation, the end of ambition, perhaps, but not of life, because the people didn't disappear. They adjusted. They planted local crops. They traded by foot. They intermarried with nearby families. They built smaller houses, dug simpler wells. They watched the river, still, but not. For canoes, for rain, for fish, for signs. And in the evenings, maybe, they told stories about the days when the river sang with voices from other lands, when the docks were crowded, when the goods were so many they spilled into the streets, when the gods came from afar and brought gifts, and when their children asked why those things didn't happen anymore, they'd simply say, "The river got quiet." Let's go back to that offering, the bowl with its bead and burned resin. Perhaps it was made during a drought, perhaps after a death, perhaps during a festival that no longer made sense. We'll never know, but we know what it means. It means someone remembered. It means someone believed the river still listened, even if the gods no longer spoke from the temple tops, even if the boats no longer came, even if the kings no longer carved names into stone. The river still flowed, and flowing things, remember, they carry not goods, but meaning. That's the hidden truth of trade. It's not just the exchange of checks, it's the exchange of belief. When a trader arrived from afar, he brought more than salt or feathers. He brought confirmation that the world still worked, a pie, that time still moved, that other people still existed and still agreed on the shape of things. When trade died, that agreement dissolved. Cities became solitudes. Calendars went out of sync. Cosmologies became regional dialects, and people had to decide what to keep. Some chose the rituals, some chose the seeds, some chose the rivers, and a few chose memory. That's what the offering in the bowl was. Not a transaction, not a plea, just a memory given back to the water. And when the river took it, he did not answer, but it did not reject it either. It carried it onward, and perhaps someday it will carry it again to another shore, to another story, to another hand that remembers what a world once was and what it meant when it flowed. What becomes of a people when the river keeps moving, but the meaning no longer follows? And what do we offer to the water when trade is gone, but the current remains?